No, not everyone is a little bit autistic. No, not everyone is on the autism spectrum. And when people say things like this, it really shows that they don't have an understanding of autism. And that's okay. And that's why I'm here to educate. Since discovering that I am autistic last year, I've made it my intention to use my platform to educate people on this topic because it really is something that not a lot of people understand. I think we should start by discussing what autism even is. Autism isn't necessarily one specific condition, and that's why there's a spectrum. It's a collection of different neurological differences that are so intertwined and almost impossible to pick apart. So those on the autism spectrum face varying degrees of difficulties with these things. Pragmatic language like social communication, body language, etc. Social awareness, having a monotropic mindset, differences with processing information, differences with interpreting sensory information, repetitive behaviors, and neuromotor differences. Now, all autistic people are affected in all of these areas, but the key point to make is that it's to varying degrees. So let's think of the autism spectrum more of like a wheel rather than a little bit autistic all the way up to extremely autistic. What makes autism a spectrum disorder is that we all experience these differences to different levels and different degrees. And many of these things aren't visible on the outside. And when people say that everyone is a little bit autistic, they might relate to one or two of these differences that autistic people have, but autism covers all of these things, not just one or two. So maybe someone only has sensory processing issues, but doesn't relate to having difficulties with socializing. This could more likely be considered sensory processing disorder. In order for someone to be considered autistic, they have to have difficulties in multiple categories spanning the entire autism spectrum. And each autistic person is affected by these things differently. So now let's talk about the diagnostic criteria for autism in the DSM-5. And we can get into the issues with the language in the DSM-5 and how problematic the DSM actually was based on the way it was created. But just to keep things simple, to meet the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder, you must have deficits in social emotional reciprocity, you must have deficits in nonverbal communication, and you must have deficits in developing and maintaining relationships. Again, I don't agree with this language. I'd like to use the word differences instead of deficits, but we're just reading from the DSM-5. And then you must show restricted or repetitive behavior in two or more of the following: stereotyped or repetitive speech, motor movements, or use of objects. And this is the category that stimming would fall into. Excessive adherence to routines, ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior, or excessive resistance to change. Highly restricted fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. Hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input, or unusual interest in sensory aspects of environment. And then these symptoms must be present in childhood, although they may not become fully recognizable until social demands exceed a limited capacity. And these symptoms must cause impairment in daily functioning. So just because you might be a little bit shy or a little bit socially awkward doesn't necessarily mean that you are autistic. It's important to note that when everyone says we're all a little bit autistic, it can be invalidating to one's own autistic experience. Being autistic is not just some quirky, silly thing. It is a challenging disability, and that's why it's called a disability, because it does cause impairments in our lives. What I think people mean to say when they do say that we're all a little bit autistic is that they can relate on one or two of these things. And one more thing that I want to share that might help too is we as humans, we all forget things, right? But that doesn't mean that we all have dementia. That doesn't mean that we all have Alzheimer's. And I think that's a good analogy that more people can understand when describing that no, not everyone is autistic. Lastly, one more thing that I want to add is that a lot of these autistic traits are observed on the outside, and they aren't really focused on the internal experience of the autistic person. So while someone may seem less autistic on the outside, they may have way more struggles with their internal experience. The thing about the autism spectrum is that we can all relate on these differences, but we all experience these differences to varying degrees, and that's why it truly is a spectrum. If you know one autistic person, you know one autistic person. And like I've said before, if I'm the only source of information that you have for autism, let's change that. There are so many other content creators out there who are autistic. There's so much more reading material out there by autistic authors. And it's important that you look at autism from many different sources because, again, we are all different.